By the second night of the blizzard, Redcliff Hollow had stopped existing as a place with edges. Wind tore across the flats at better than 50 miles an hour, and the cold had fallen past anything the almanac had prepared anyone for. Inside the sheep shed, the flock pressed into one shivering mass. A support beam along the east wall groaned under a snowdrift it was never built to hold. Somewhere, out past the last marker stake, a man was still missing. Wade Colton tied a length of rope around his waist and pressed the other end into Adeline Shaw's hands. "If it goes," he said, "you let go before you follow it." She didn't answer that. She only tightened her grip. 6 weeks earlier, Wade had arrived at this ranch with nothing to offer but a plea and a boy who no longer believed in tomorrow. How was it that the survival of the whole flock now rested on whether he could keep his footing in the dark? Late in August of 1889, Wade Colton reached Redcliff Hollow with a handcart, a folded wool blanket, and his son. He was 34, though the road had put more years on him than that. His coat had been patched at both elbows with mismatched cloth. 7-year-old Tobias walked beside the cartwheel without asking how much farther they had left to go. He had learned, somewhere along the rail line, that the answer never changed anything. Wade's wife, Sarah, had died the previous spring, a fever that took her in 4 days and left him raising a boy alone while trying to keep pace with a repair crew that had no patience for a man who needed to stop and feed a child. 2 ranches had already sent him away. One took his labor and left Tobias standing in the rain until the work was done. The other simply said no and shut the door before Wade could explain why he was asking. On their last night on the road, Tobias had gone to sleep with half a biscuit hidden inside his coat, the same way he did every night now, in case tomorrow's promise didn't hold. Wade had stopped telling him it would. Then the fence line of Shaw Hollow rose past a stand of dead cottonwoods. The shed roof sagged in the middle. Its single door faced due north, straight into the wind that came down off the ridge. And in the yard, a woman in a man's canvas coat was breaking a skin of ice off a water trough 3 weeks before any trough in the valley had earned the right to freeze. She looked at the stranger and the boy for a long moment before he spoke first. "Give my child some food. I'll do whatever you need. I don't care what it costs me." Adeline Shaw didn't answer right away. Her eyes moved from the boy's hollow cheeks to the man's raw, cracked hands and stayed there. "What do you know how to do?" Wade set the cart handles down for the first time in 11 miles. "Whatever needs doing. Barns, fence, water lines, hand pumps. I've laid shingle in weather that should have killed the job and mended an axle with a fence post when there was nothing else to use." His eyes moved past her to the shed. "That roof's carrying more weight than it was built for, and that door's facing the wrong way for this valley. Wind runs northwest down this hollow. Anybody can see that from how your cottonwoods lean." Adeline's mouth tightened, not quite anger, more the look of a woman hearing out loud a thing she'd been too tired to say to herself. "That shed's stood 2 winters. 2 mild ones. You've been here 5 minutes. I've been watching for 10. She studied him. Then she studied Tobias, who hadn't moved from the cartwheel, his coat sleeves stopping 2 inches short of his wrists. "Kitchen's this way," she said finally. "The boy eats first. Your opinions about my barn can wait until I've seen your hands do something besides hold a cart handle." She fed them at a scarred plank table, cold biscuit, salt pork, warm milk poured slow so Tobias wouldn't choke on it. The boy ate without lifting his eyes from the bowl, and twice Wade watched him tuck a piece of biscuit into his coat instead of eating it. Adeline saw it too. She said nothing. She only set another biscuit beside his bowl, as if it had always been there. Between bites they traded only what mattered. Joel Shaw had died 2 winters back, thrown from a hay wagon in a fall that should have broken nothing, and broke everything instead. Adeline had run the flock alone since 40 head, a shed that had never once been built right, and no children of her own, a fact she stated plainly, the way a person states the weather. Wade told her about Sarah, about the fever, about a boy who now flinched at raised voices and hid food before he let himself trust it was his to keep. "He talks?" Adeline asked. "When there's a reason to." She rose without another word and came back with a folded wool blanket, moth-eaten at one corner, but clean. "Joel's mother made this. Been in a trunk longer than it's been on a bed." That night, Tobias slept wrapped in it by the stove, and for the first time in 3 weeks, Wade watched his son's shoulders loosen instead of staying pulled tight against a cold he still expected to find indoors. Before sunrise, Wade walked the property without touching a single tool. He dug 2 fingers into the dirt at the base of the shed's north wall and found it damp 6 inches down. He crouched at the doorway and let a length of wool thread hang in the gap, watching how the draft curled it sideways instead of letting it hang straight. "Your shed's not cold because the walls are thin," he told Adeline when she came out to watch him. "It's cold because that door faces straight into the wind, and there's nowhere for the damp air to leave once it's in. It just sits." He nodded at the sagging ridge beam. "That's not age. That's water finding the weak spot every time it rains. Same place, over and over. My father-in-law built that shed, 30 years standing. It stood because the winters were kind to it. Weather doesn't ask a building for its history before it tests it." Something shifted behind her eyes, not agreement, but the look of a person weighing a stranger's words against a truth she'd already half known alone. "1 week," she said. "Fix what you can with what's already lying around this place. No new lumber unless I say so. If it holds through the first real frost, we'll talk about what comes after. And if it doesn't, then you'll have your answer, same as me." The door came first. Wade unhinged it from its northward frame and moved it to the eastern wall, in the lee of the low ridge. By midday, it hung true. Then he cut a second, smaller opening high on the gable end and fitted it with a hinged flap, a vent, to let the damp air climb out while the door let fresh air move in low. It seemed, for one afternoon, like the answer to everything. Then the wind shifted, and Wade learned it wasn't. The vent sat too close to the roof's peak, directly in the path of the ridge's downdraft. Instead of drawing the damp air up and out, it caught the wind coming over the roofline and threw it straight back down into the pen, cold, fast, and aimed at exactly the animals it was meant to protect. By evening, 3 ewes stood shivering in a corner they'd never crowded into before, and the straw beneath the vent had gone damp with condensation that hadn't been there that morning. Adeline found him standing under it at dusk, one hand raised into the draft. "That's worse than nothing." "I know." Wade didn't defend it. "I put it where I thought the air would want to go. I didn't watch which way the wind actually comes over that roof first." He tied a strip of cloth to the vent's edge and watched it for the better part of an hour, tracking how the wind rolled off the ridge and slammed down instead of sweeping past. Then he moved the vent 18 inches west, off the peak entirely, and built a small wooden baffle above it, a simple lean-to shape that broke the wind's downward push before it ever reached the opening. The second version worked from the first hour, but it had cost him a full day and a night of 3 shivering ewes he couldn't take back. "Take it out," Adeline said the next morning, studying the baffle with her arms crossed. "Board the whole thing back over. We managed 2 winters without a hole in the roof. The hole's not the problem. Where I first put it was." Wade tied a fresh strip of cloth to the vent's edge and let her watch it flutter outward, steady, instead of driving down the way it had before. "You throw out the idea because the first try was wrong? you'll be back to a shed that sweats itself sick every damp week from now until spring." Adeline watched the cloth a long moment, saying nothing. She didn't board it over, but she didn't thank him for it either, and Wade understood that was its own kind of answer. Tobias's job was the water line. Wade found it running barely a foot under the soil in places, with no fall to it, meaning once the ground froze, whatever water sat in the pipe would freeze with it and stay frozen until spring did the work no man could hurry. "Watch the level," Wade told him, handing over a length of twine with a stone tied to the end. "Every 10 paces, tell me if the ground's rising or falling." Tobias didn't answer at first, but he took the twine, and by the 3rd hour he was calling out, "Up!" and "Down!" without being asked twice, the most words Wade had heard from him since they left the rail camp. Adeline, passing with a feed bucket, paused long enough to watch. She said nothing to Wade. That evening she set an extra spoonful of stew in Tobias's bowl before he'd even sat down. On the 3rd afternoon, a rider came down the ridge trail at the unhurried pace of a man who already believed he owned the ground he was crossing. Cyrus Bell ran the largest cattle operation in the hollow and made no secret of thinking sheep didn't belong in it. He'd tried twice to buy Shaw Hollow's water rights since Joel died, and twice Adeline had refused him. He dismounted without being asked, thumbs in his belt, studying the new eastern door with open amusement. "Widow's found herself a carpenter," he said, not quite to Adeline, not quite to Wade. "Or is this charity, ma'am, feeding drifters for a door that used to face the wrong way and still might?" "It faces the right way now," Adeline said. "You know sheep, boy, or just wood?" Cyrus asked Wade. "Enough of both to keep them from dying of something a dry shed would have prevented. Big talk for a man working borrowed nails." Cyrus nudged a fence post with his boot, testing it, though it didn't move. "This whole hollow's cattle country. Sheep foul the grass, and everyone downstream of a sheep well knows it." He looked back to Adeline. "Come first snow, you'll wish you'd sold that water when I offered fair money." "The well's not for sale. Wasn't the last time you asked either." Cyrus mounted without another word, though he paused to look once more at the shed roof before turning his horse. "Winter'll settle who's right about that door," he said, and rode off without looking back. Tobias watched until the rider vanished over the rise. "What if he's right?" Wade picked up his hammer again. "Then we'll find out. A man doesn't get to decide a thing's wrong just by saying it loud enough." A week after Wade arrived, an elderly woman drove a small wagon down from the eastern road, a crate of eggs and a jug of goat's milk riding beside her on the bench. Nettie Doss had buried 2 husbands and outlived a dozen hard winters on the ridge above Redcliff Hollow, and she made a quiet habit of knowing everyone's business before they knew it themselves. "Cyrus Bell's telling anyone who'll listen that you've taken in strays," she said to Adeline, setting the eggs on the porch step. Her eyes moved to Wade, assessing, unhurried. "And his man Jesse Calder's been laughing about a sheep door that faces the wrong way." "It faces the right way," Adeline said, for what felt like the 3rd time that week. "I imagine it does." Nettie's gaze lingered on Tobias, who was coiling rope by the fence with the careful concentration of a boy who'd learned that being useful was safer than being noticed. She noted the bread crust still folded in his coat pocket, said nothing about it, and left an extra loaf on the table when she departed. "Leave that one too," she told Adeline, before Adeline had asked. 10 days in, a second rider arrived, this one alone, unhurried, carrying a satchel instead of a rope. Hiram Cobb was the county's livestock inspector, a narrow, patient man who rode from ranch to ranch each fall checking barns before the hard cold set in. He'd heard, he said, that the widow at Shaw Hollow was rebuilding before winter, and he wanted to see it for himself. He didn't laugh at the new door. He asked harder questions instead. "How deep's your bedding?" he asked, crouching at the pen and pushing his bare hand into the straw.
Near a foot, Adeline said. Joel always bedded it deep before first frost. Never had trouble with it that I recall.
Depth's not the trouble by itself. It's depth without turning. Cobb worked his fingers lower into the packed layer beneath. Straw held this deep, this long, without disturbing it. It starts working like a compost pile from the inside. Animal doesn't need to be cold to get sick. Sometimes it just needs to be breathing what's rising up out of its own bedding. Neither of them had known to look for it. It wasn't a thing either had done wrong so much as a thing neither had known to ask. He showed Wade how to divide the bedding into smaller sections, with turning done every third day, keeping the bottom layer from ever fully compacting. He checked the new vent, nodded once at the baffle Wade had added after the first failed attempt, and made no comment on the mistake itself, only the fix. Before leaving, he made one request. Keep a ledger, morning and evening temperature, what you feed, what you use for medicine, which animals cough and which don't. Numbers tell you things your eyes miss, especially eyes that are tired. Adeline had a feed ledger already, its spine cracked from years of tallying grain. That evening she opened a fresh page and handed the pencil to Tobias. Write today's date, she said, and the morning temperature. The boy wrote carefully, the numbers a little crooked, and from that morning on, the ranch kept a record that would, weeks later, speak louder than anyone's opinion. 2 nights after Cobb's visit, 2 ewes took the cough, a wet, rattling sound in their breathing that Wade recognized from men he'd watched die of chest fever on the rail line. Get them out, Adeline said, already moving toward the tack room. Away from the others, now. They built a narrow isolation pen off the east wall. Straw laid a proper 8 inches deep this time, turned rather than packed. Adeline mixed mustard powder into bear grease and rubbed it into the wool over each ew's chest. But Wade, working fast and wanting to do more than watch, mixed his own second batch heavier on the mustard, guessing that more would mean faster relief. By morning, the skin beneath the wool on the ewe he'd treated had blistered raw. That's too much mustard and not enough grease, Adeline said, examining the burn with her jaw tight, though not at him exactly, more at the situation itself. My mother-in-law's recipe was thin on purpose, enough to warm the skin, not enough to burn it. You can't rush a body into healing by doubling what helped a little. Wade said nothing in his own defense. He scraped the plaster away as gently as he could and rubbed plain grease over the raw skin instead, feeling the weight of it, another thing he'd gotten wrong by wanting too badly for it to be right the first time. We start over, he said, your way, all the way through. They mixed a new batch to Adeline's measure, and by the second evening, both sick ewes had stopped shivering, though one still lay listless, her breathing shallow. She didn't see morning. Wade found her before Adeline did. He carried her out himself, past the pen where Tobias stood watching, and laid her beside the fence line. Why didn't it work? Tobias asked. It was the most words he'd said in 2 days. Wade crouched to his son's level. Sometimes it doesn't. That's not because we did something wrong every time. Sometimes an animal's too far gone before we ever get the chance to help. He didn't soften it further. Sarah's death had already taught him what it cost to pretend the world was kinder than it was. The second ewe lived. By week's end, she'd rejoined the flock, thinner, breathing clean. That evening, Adeline sat with the ledger open but the pencil still, the page blank where the mustard mixture should have been recorded. You're not writing it down, Wade said. Cobb reads this book. She didn't look up. I'd rather he see a ranch that gets things right. He'll see a ranch that gets things wrong and fixes them. That's the only kind there is. Wade nodded at the blank line. Leave it out, and the next person who mixes a batch too strong has nothing to warn them. Numbers that only tell the good news aren't numbers. They're just another kind of guessing. Adeline studied the page a moment longer. Then she wrote it. The strength of the first batch, the burn, the correction, in the same steady hand she used for everything else. Cyrus Bell rode past again 10 days later, slower this time, taking in the isolation pen, the fresh straw, the flock grazing calm beyond it. "Lost one, I hear," he said, not dismounting.
"Lost one," Adeline agreed. "Kept 40.
"Word in town is you're feeding a drifter and his boy on credit you don't have." His eyes cut to Wade, working a fence post a dozen yards off, close enough to hear every word and clearly meant to. "Men like that don't stay once the work runs dry."
"Then it's fortunate the work hasn't run dry," Adeline said. Jesse Calder, one of Cyrus's hands, had ridden along this time, and he laughed from the saddle at that, loud enough to carry. "Heard you had him building a door that catches wind on both sides now."
"Might as well leave it off the hinges." "Come see it work," Wade said, not looking up from the post he was setting.
"Maybe I will," Jesse said, "when there's nothing better to laugh at." Cyrus turned his horse toward the ridge trail before he left, pausing. "First real snow's coming within the fortnight. Ask any old-timer. The year starts mean, it stays mean. You'll want that water line dug proper before the ground locks, or you'll be hauling from my well all winter."
"At my price." "Line's dug," Wade called after him. 4 foot, proper fall. It'll hold." Cyrus said nothing further. He rode off, Jesse's laughter trailing behind him. Tobias, coiling rope nearby, glanced up. "He keeps coming back." "Some men can't stand watching something work that they didn't build themselves," Wade said. That evening, after Tobias had fallen asleep by the stove, no longer needing to be watched to see if he'd wake hungry, Wade found Adeline on the porch, wrapped in a shawl, looking out at the flock settling for the night. "You didn't have to feed us that first evening," he said. "Most wouldn't have. Most wouldn't have needed a carpenter as badly as I did." There was no edge to it. "Joel used to say, a ranch only survives on what it can afford to lose." He never once wrote down what he couldn't afford to lose. "I think that's why we lost as much as we did before you came. The water fight, a bad hay year, all of it. He never kept numbers on what mattered, only on what he wanted to be true." "And you do?" "I have to. There's no one else left to." She looked over at him, lantern light catching the tired lines at her eyes. "You didn't come here for a home. You came here because you'd run out of doors to knock on." Wade didn't argue the point. "That's true." "Then we understand each other." She rose, gathering her shawl closer. 1 week's near up. The door held through the wind. The vent's holding now that it's built right. The line held through the frost. Whatever's coming next will tell us if it holds through worse. "It will," Wade said. "You don't know that." "No," he admitted, and reached into his coat pocket, drawing out a small leather case, worn soft at the corners. Sarah's mending kit, a bone thimble, and a spool of waxed thread still inside it, carried the whole way from the rail camp because he hadn't been able to leave it behind. He turned it over once in his hand before putting it away again. "But I've learned what it costs to guess wrong and not go back and fix it. I don't plan on making that mistake twice out here with what's yours." Something in Adeline's face eased, just slightly. Not quite a smile, but close enough to notice. "Keep that kit dry," she said. "You'll need it before winter's through. Canvas doesn't mend itself." The sky turned 3 days before the blizzard, exactly the way Nettie Doss had warned it would when she'd last driven through. The wind died first, a stillness so complete the flock stopped grazing and stood facing one direction, ears low. Then clouds rolled in from the northwest in a single, unbroken wall, swallowing the ridge whole. "That's not a squall coming," Adeline said, shading her eyes, though there was no sun to block. "That's the real one." They spent the last daylight preparing. Wade drove marker stakes between house and shed, one every 15 paces, each wrapped at the top with a strip of white cloth. He strung a guide rope from porch post to shed door, testing every knot twice. The flock moved into the sheltered pen along the eastern wall. Extra straw went down, turned fresh that morning per Cobb's instruction. The lantern oil was topped. A repair bag, hammer, spare rope, dry wool for packing gaps, and Sarah's mending kit, tucked in at the last moment, waited by the door. "Why do we need the rope and the posts both?" Tobias asked, watching his father tie off the last stake. "Rope keeps a man from drifting," Wade said. "Posts tell him if he's still going somewhere." By dusk the wind returned all at once, a wall of cold slamming down off the ridge hard enough to rattle the shutters. Snow followed within the hour, and unlike anything before it, this snow did not stop. By the second night, Redcliff Hollow had vanished entirely. Wade could no longer see the shed from the porch, though it stood less than 40 paces off. The wind carried a sound he'd never fully get used to. Not a howl, but a low, constant pressure, as though the whole sky leaned against the walls. Near midnight, a dull pounding echoed from somewhere beyond the last marker stake. Not the wind, but something with rhythm to it, deliberate. Wade followed the guide rope out, then the line of stakes into the white dark, until he found Jesse Calder collapsed near the second-to-last post, close enough to the shed that Wade dragged him there, instead of risking the longer stretch to the house. Jesse's horse was long gone. He'd tied a length of his own rope around his waist before it bolted. The same instinct that had kept Wade upright 3 nights running, and the coil still hung slack from his belt when Wade hauled him through the shed door onto a bed of doubled sacking. Wade's hands had stopped answering properly by then, numbed past feeling from the long minutes of exposure getting Jesse in. He was still working the stiffness out of his fingers when the lantern light caught it. A drift built waist-high against the shed's east interior wall, higher than it had any right to be this early in the storm. Adeline was as far as he got before the crack sounded above them. The support beam along the east pen had begun to give. Wade grabbed for a spare fence rail, but his numb hands fumbled the first attempt, the rail slipping loose before he could set it. Behind him, Jesse, barely conscious, teeth still chattering, pushed the coiled rope off his own belt toward Wade's reaching hand without a word. Wade lashed the rail to it, braced the beam at an angle, and this time it held. Behind him, in the dark, one of the ewes, heavy with a lamb no one had expected until spring, went down hard onto her side. Adeline arrived seconds later, having followed the rope despite Wade's shouted warning to stay inside. One look told her what Wade hadn't yet understood.
"She's in trouble. Lamb's turned. I need my hands clean or we lose them both." There was no warm water to be had. Wade packed snow into a tin and held it near the lantern flame, melting just enough to rinse her hands as the storm allowed.
Tobias, who had followed against every instruction given him, held the lantern steady with both hands, his face pale, his grip sure. Jesse, dragging himself upright against the wall a few feet off, packed loose straw closer around the birthing pen, with hands that still wouldn't fully close, saying nothing, needing to be doing something. "Talk to her," Adeline said, nodding at the ew's head. "Keep her calm." Wade knelt and murmured low and steady, the way he once had to a spooked horse mid-storm, while Adeline worked with careful, patient hands, easing the lamb's forelegs straight, one at a time. The braced beam groaned again above them, holding. The lamb came free, small and still. For one long moment, nothing happened. Adeline cleared its mouth, rubbed hard along its ribs with dry straw. Then it drew its first ragged breath,
and let out a thin, indignant cry that cut clean through the sound of the storm. Jessie, still shivering against the wall, watched the lamb find its feet and press toward its mother, and said nothing about doors or wind after that. The storm broke on the fourth morning, leaving a silence so complete it felt like its own kind of sound. Wade walked the shed with a notebook instead of relief, the way he always did after something proved itself, counting what had failed before counting what had survived. The brace beam needed proper replacing, not a rail wedged at an angle. 2 marker stakes had vanished under drift taller than Tobias. The mustard plaster jar, he noted, needed a second, weaker batch kept ready separately, so no one reached for the stronger mix in a hurry again. "You've counted every weakness before you've counted what's still standing," Adeline said, finding him crouched at the eastern wall. "The living can wait an hour," Wade said. "A weakness left unwritten has a way of hiding until it costs something worse." 40 ewes had gone into the storm. 40 had come out, plus one small, indignant addition nobody had planned for. Hiram Cobb returned once the roads opened, riding the circuit as he always did after a hard storm, to see what had held and what hadn't. He read every page of the ledger, the temperatures, the bedding turns, the mustard mixture corrected after the burn, the vent baffle added after the first failed placement. "I wouldn't call any of this proven," he said, closing the book, "but it's doing exactly what it should, which is more than I can say for half this valley." He looked toward the shed. "Whose idea was the baffle?" "Mine," Wade said, "after I built it wrong the first time." Cobb nodded once, unsurprised. "Most men don't admit that part in a ledger. It's usually the part worth writing down most." Nettie Doss drove down the morning the roads opened enough to manage it, a fresh jug of goat's milk riding beside her, same as always. She took in the shed standing whole, the flock grazing calm, Jessie still favoring 2 frostbitten fingers as he coiled rope by the fence. "Cyrus lost the better part of his north line shack roof," she said, setting the jug on the porch step, "and near lost the man standing right there from what I hear." Her eyes moved to Tobias, who sat on the step shelling the last of the winter's dried beans, both hands free, nothing tucked away in his coat. She didn't say anything about that. She only nodded once, the way a person does when a thing they'd been watching for finally resolves itself, and left an extra loaf on the table anyway, not because it was needed this time, but because it had become custom. Cyrus Bell arrived last, 2 days after that, his own operation having lost a section of line shack roof and nearly lost the man he'd sent to check it. He said nothing when he saw the flock whole in the yard, the shed standing with its eastern door facing away from the wind, exactly as Wade had built it. "Door still facing the wrong way?" Adeline asked, not unkindly, though there was no missing the edge beneath it. Cyrus didn't answer that directly. "Jessie says your marker stakes are the reason he's alive to complain about anything at all." "They are," Wade said. Cyrus looked at the shed a long moment more, then turned his horse without another word. Word moved through the hollow within the month that his own hands had been sent to study the door and the stakes both before the next storm came. Winter did not end kindly, but it ended having asked its questions and gotten its answers. The ledger filled steadily through the cold months, and by the time the first green returned in early May, the flock numbered 42, counting the storm lamb and one more born healthy in the quiet weeks after. Tobias walked the fence line each morning now on his own, checking the water line the way his father had first taught him, calling out what he found without needing to be asked. He spoke more these days, not constantly, never in a rush, but steadily, the way a person speaks once they've stopped waiting for the ground to shift under them again. One evening, shelling dried beans at the table, he looked up at Adeline. "Why didn't you ever have children of your own?" "Some rooms get built and never filled," she said, the way she must have said it to herself many times before, alone, in a house too quiet for one person. Tobias glanced toward the yard,
where his father was setting a fence post in the last light. "That one's not empty anymore." Adeline said nothing to that. But that evening, Wade came in to find the extra chair at the table already set, the same quiet way it had been set every evening since the storm, not asked for, simply there. Weeks later, mending a torn seam on Tobias's coat with Sarah's old bone thimble, Wade found the boy watching him. "That was Mama's," Tobias said.
Not a question.
It was. Tobias reached into his coat pocket, out of habit, and found nothing there. No hoarded crust, no hidden bread. He looked almost surprised by that himself, then let it go, and didn't reach for the pocket again after. They didn't marry as soon as the thaw came. There was too much work left, a beam to properly replace, a second shed to raise before the flock outgrew the first. But on a clear evening in late June, with the grass tall enough to hide the marker stakes that had once guided two people and a half-frozen stranger through a blizzard, Wade found Adeline on the porch, the ledger open on her lap, though she wasn't writing in it. "You said you'd stay until the work proved you out," he said. "I did." "Has it?" She closed the ledger slowly. "The flock's whole, the shed's sound." The boy laughs now, when he didn't before. She looked up at him. "I'd say the work's proved plenty." Below them in the yard, Tobias chased a lamb in slow, easy circles, laughing in a voice that no longer sounded like it belonged to a boy who once counted his food before he'd let himself eat it. The ranch had not survived because the winter showed mercy. It had shown none. It survived because every weakness, the vent, the mustard, the bedding, the beam, had been found, admitted, and mended before the storm came to test it again. And because two people who had each stopped expecting anyone to stay had, without quite meaning to, stopped being alone.